just 50 days remain before the November 5th general election, where we will select the next president of the United States, Vice President Kamala Harris, or former President Donald Trump. There's also statewide races involving the U.S. Senate, U.S. Congress, and statewide races including Auditor General, Attorney General, and State Treasurer. We're going to cover a lot of subjects today on Voices of Reason, as we'll talk with Republican Auditor General Tim DeFoor. We'll talk to Philadelphia Inquirer national political writer Julia Terruso, and we'll discuss all the topics of the day with our Powerhouse Roundtable from the staff of Broad and Liberty. All this and more today on Voices of Reason. Now on Voices of Reason, we're pleased to be joined by the Pennsylvania Auditor General, Tim DeFoor, who was elected in 2020, the first person of color to win statewide office in Pennsylvania and the first Republican to capture the Auditor General position since 1997. Auditor General DeFoor, thanks so much for joining us today.
Steve, thank you for having me on your show.
Well, first of all, can you give us just a little bit of your background? We discussed offline your undergraduate experience, but tell us a little bit more about your background.
Well, first of all, if someone were to write a book about me, it would be titled, "How Did a Shy Kid Who Hated Math and Politics End Up Getting Elected Auditor General?" But I'm going to go back to when I was a kid. My parents used to always talk to me and my 5 siblings about government, how government operated. And I was always curious. And they would kind of joke about paying taxes and what government did with taxes, with their tax dollars.
Right.
So I was always kind of curious myself as a young kid. Now, growing up, I had no ambitions of being an auditor. I don't think any kid does. But I did have an ambition of being in law enforcement to investigate people who were actually stealing from government. And that was something I was very fortunate to do when I was with the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania Office of the Inspector General, where I investigated government fraud, waste, and abuse, and then ultimately going to the Attorney General's office, where I investigated Medicaid fraud and prescription drug diversion. So my entire career, in one way or another, has been spent investigating how government tax dollars are being spent and whether individuals receiving it are in fact abusing our tax dollars. And it goes back to the conversation that I had as a kid with my parents.
So my understanding is certainly the Auditor General is charged with monitoring the spending of public funds, but certainly there's much more to that probably most of the general public is unaware of.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot that we do. I first want to say that we have about 390 dedicated employees. Most of them are auditors, and there are 9,000 entities in the Commonwealth that we are responsible for auditing. I mean, some of them could be a large state department like Department of Transportation, and others could be entities receiving government funds. And our duties and responsibilities are to audit anybody who receives any type of state tax dollars, to make sure, number one, that those funds are being spent the way they're supposed to be spent, and number two, that entities are being efficient and transparent, key word, with our government tax dollars, and programs that are funded by the government, are those programs in fact working? And of course, we do that by performing audits. We produce about 3,700 audits a year. So there's a lot that we do. And right now, I'd have to say that our focus is doing the job. I mean, how is the job supposed to be done? That is our focus.
How many of those 3,700 audits on average per year are required by Pennsylvania statute?
I'd have to say at least between 80 and 90% of the audits that we do are statutory required. And those are the ones that, quite frankly, we have to take care of first. I mean, if we are legally required to do something, then we're going to do it. So, and we're going to do it in a way that is efficient, and we're going to do it in a way that follows auditing standards. Now, in addition to being statutory required to perform audits, the way that we go about doing audits, there are also standards that we have to follow, and those are federal government auditing standards. So while we're performing our audits, we can't just perform an audit any way that we want to. There are standards that we must follow because we are also audited. We're audited by the governor's office, and we're audited by there's a peer review that is also done by a group of outside entities made up of auditor generals and auditors, comptrollers from across the country. So we are audited twice by different entities, and if we are not following the generally accepted government auditing standards, then those are going to be identified in the audit. And if it's one thing an auditor doesn't like, in addition to being audited, is to have audit findings in your audit, especially by your peers.
Well, let me follow up on that, because to the average layperson, you hear the word audit and it strikes fear down your spine, certainly. You're saying that you feel the same way when your peers look at your work as well.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the things, and it's going to sound weird me saying this, but I'm very sincere when I say this. It's like, we're here to audit you. We're here from the government. We're here to help. And and the average person or the average auditee, when they hear that, they kind of roll their eyes and say, "Yeah, right, you're here to help."
Right.
But it's actually it's true, because audits are a tool. Audits are a tool to determine if things are working the way they're supposed to work. And if there are findings, then you address the findings in a way that makes sense, and you don't accuse anybody, you don't attack anybody, you don't weaponize audits. You simply state, if there's no findings, fantastic. If there are, you simply state what they are and come up with a common sense approach on how to resolve any type of audit issues. I mean, audits should never in any way be weaponized, because they're really a tool to help government understand what's going on. Even here in state government with the governor, my job is to inform the governor whether or not, well, actually, what is happening with our tax dollars, whether the program is working, whether we are being efficient. My job is to inform the governor of what's going on.
One of the things that jumped out at me as I was preparing for the interview was one of the audits that I think that your office did that drew a lot of attention was with Governor Wolf and the pandemic waivers that were being given out. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so basically we looked into the process. I mean, how the process came about, how the process transpired from the very beginning of the policy that was set in place to the end of the pandemic. And one of the things that we mentioned in our finding, and this is probably the key finding, be transparent. And that's probably the one thing that whenever we audit a large governmental entity, the one thing that we always end up talking about at the end of that audit is to be transparent. And that's one of my jobs, is to make sure that government, in fact, is transparent. I mean, as far as what happened during COVID, I mean, that was the first time and hopefully the last time that we'll ever experience that. But going back to that audit, there wasn't any consistency, and there was no transparency with regards to what's going on. And also, if you are going to shut down businesses because they may not be life-sustaining businesses, talk to business owners first prior to shutting anything down, and be transparent and be consistent with regards to what you're doing, because some businesses were shut down, may not had to have been shut down, and they never came back. So just be transparent and include business owners in the process.
You had mentioned that 80 to 90% of the audits that the office does are required by state law. Let's talk about the other 10 to 20%. Are those things that perhaps your staff is uncovering? Are you receiving tips from the general public when they call the state's fiscal watchdog and want to advise you of something? What happens with that other 15 to 20%?
Well, so here's what happens. So as far as how we receive um, information on what to audit, we can receive that from anybody. We can receive it from the governor's office, the governor's administration, the legislature. We can receive it from someone like yourself. We could receive it from a civic group doing work for the state government. We can receive it from a private citizen. So one of the things we receive complaints from everybody. And one of the things that we do, there's no, whenever we receive information, we don't ignore, we always look into it. And it starts with, we have our legal staff. They look into whether or not it's a valid complaint. And also, this is something that's also extremely important, whether or not it's an audit that we can perform. Because there's some audits that legally we cannot perform. The only audits that we can perform are audits in which state funds are in fact being used, but also if federal government gives Pennsylvania funds and it goes through the treasurer's office, then we can audit those. As far as local funds, we cannot audit. As far as county funds, we cannot audit. So there is very specific things that we have to determine first if we can audit something.
As we started with in the opening, 23 years since a Republican has held the Auditor General position, you're running for a second term. What are some of your goals that you're pointing toward as priorities as you get ready for a possible second term in Harrisburg?
Well, here's a couple of things. One of the things that we did, we transformed the department. We created a workforce development bureau, and that's to help with a career ladder internally. And we also created several programs, intern to hire program, where at the end of an internship, you're going to have a job. We also created the Be Money Smart Financial Literacy Initiative, where we are bringing awareness to financial literacy. And because of our advocacy, Pennsylvania is now the 25th state in the country to require that some type of financial literacy be taught to graduating seniors. But we've also transformed how we perform school audits. School audits, we're now performing school audits through our performance audit bureau, because in reality, that's what they are. How are schools performing with taxpayer dollars? We're no longer doing rubber stamp audits where we take information from the Department of Education, put it in an audit report, they give it back to them for them to decide what to do. We're no longer doing those types of things. So what are some of the things that are most impactful? Another thing that we're looking at, we realized that there is going to be the need for a forensic audit section. We had not done forensic audits. So right now we are in the process of developing a forensic audit section. And also we are now starting to audit based on what are the risks, what are the vulnerabilities to the Commonwealth. So we're auditing on that too. So a lot of what we're going to do in the second term are things that we are already started building on, but we want to make sure that what we've done, the transformation that we've done, becomes a part that's ingrained not only for this administration, but for administrations to come.
Certainly, as we are talking politics here, as you run for re-election, you're up against Democrat Malcolm Kenyatta, who does not have apparently the same type of background in auditing that you had. What does that mean as you campaign against him?
So here's what it means. And I'm an auditor. I mean, I've been a law enforcement officer and I've been an auditor my entire career. I understand the work. You can win an election for Auditor General, but if you don't understand the work, how are you effectively going to lead a department? It pretty much makes you a figurehead. I can talk to my senior auditors on an auditing level. I can make recommendations on how to improve the work that we do. based on my prior knowledge of auditing on the county level, auditing on the state level, auditing on the federal level, and in the private sector. So I feel that I'm uniquely qualified to be in this position. So, and that's the interesting thing about this office is it's subject matter expert. It requires a subject matter expert to effectively do this job, not someone who's a politician.
One of the things that I think I'd love to have you explain at another time is the auditing that would go into college football recruiting, as you have a family member who is currently
Yeah,
being actively recruited by one of Pennsylvania's finest state-related institutions. Is that correct?
that is correct, and also was also offered from my alma mater, which is which is another university on the western side of the state. But and it's an experience. It is quite the experience, and I'm happy to be part of it. It's opened my eyes up to a lot, and it's fun, it's stressful, it's exciting. You never know what you're going to get, who's going to call from one day to another. You never know.
I can only imagine from my time in college athletics what you're going through, but that's another story for another day, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about that when the process is concluded. Tim DeFoor, Pennsylvania's Auditor General, thank you very much for joining us today on Voices of Reason.
Thank you for having me.
Now on Voices of Reason, we're pleased to be joined by the national political writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer, Julia Terruso. Julia, a local product, graduated from Lower Merion High School, a 2011 graduate of Syracuse University, is now doing wonderful work for the Inquirer. Julia, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. Good to see you.
We were both in the spin room Tuesday night at the convention center. What were your thoughts on everything that transpired Tuesday night, not only during the debate, but afterwards?
Yeah, it's interesting, sitting there watching debate with you in the spin room. I did think it seemed like a pretty strong night for Vice President Kamala Harris, and perhaps some missed opportunities for former President Donald Trump. It was a little surprised how easily he seemed baited by her on some questions or some topics, and more so than him having a couple moments where I think he looked somewhat unpresidential, which we know is something people trying to make up their minds about Trump. That can factor into. But more so than that, I just thought there were a couple of moments where he kind of missed an opportunity to keep the conversation focused on the economy, to hold her feet to the fire a little bit on some of her past stances on various issues, which I think benefited her because she didn't face kind of some tough questioning on that. That said, when I stepped out of kind of our bubble of watching the debate, and I did call up some undecided voters in Pennsylvania, it was pretty amazing to me how, I didn't have a huge sample size to call, but in conversations with a few of them, they hadn't been moved that much. Some of their concerns remained, some of their concerns about the economy remained, and a few of them said they still felt like they needed to know more about the vice president. So we're going to hear more as the actual polls start coming out. I'd be surprised if there's not even a tiny bit of movement, but that's kind of my initial reaction, and then some of what I heard from those voters who might actually decide this thing.
Well, you make an interesting point there. Both camps seem pretty set in their ways at this point. We're fighting over a small slice of voters, and perhaps just the format didn't provide enough for those who are still making up their mind to finalize their decision moving forward, just based on that 90 minutes.
It could be that. It could also be that for that small group of voters, neither one of these people is the perfect candidate. And so, it might not come down to what they say on the debate stage, but in the last minute, kind of which way their gut moves them.
what do you think, in your opinion, what will Pennsylvania's swing state status mean for the Dow ballot races, such as the U.S. Senate race between Bob Casey Jr. and Dave McCormick, and some of the other statewide races?
It's a great question. And I think there's also the question of, could any of those races actually impact the top of the ballot? Although we know it's almost always the other way around. Senator Casey continues to outperform first President Biden and now Vice President Harris in most polls. I do think we could see a lot of split tickets in this election. I think we saw that in 2020. I think you could see some outcomes that don't necessarily make it a wave in either direction, especially just because of how close the state seems to be. Just anecdotally, I was doing some reporting in Luzerne County and was talking to a mayor of a small town, well, not that small, Pittston up there. And he was very candid about, I think he's supporting the Auditor General, DeFoor, but is also supporting Representative Cartwright because of the kind of support he feels his town has gotten. So I think there are a lot of voters like that who are kind of voting on the people perhaps more than the party, and that could shake things up a little bit.
Especially now with Act 77 eliminating straight party voting, straight ticket voting in
Exactly.
the Commonwealth. As both campaigns are fighting in the last 50 days to try to solidify their base, who do you think is more important in the presidential race in Pennsylvania? Is it female voters or is it Latino voters, as both camps battle for those camps?
That's a really good question. When it comes down to I always say, I feel like Pennsylvania is this very complicated puzzle, and any piece really could matter, which I know is not what people want to hear, but any shift here or there could make the difference. I think I'd be tempted to say women, because there are more female voters in Pennsylvania, but we've seen that gender gap with more women preferring Vice President Harris for months, or well, as long as she's been in the race, for a couple months now. And it's still looking pretty even. So it could also come down to the Latino voters who are growing in the state, who the former president has clearly won over a lot of. So I'm gonna kind of pass and say to be determined. What do you think?
Fair enough. The Latino belt between Harrisburg, Reading, Allentown is an important stretch, but I'm not sure for the presidential race, it may be the tipping point as much as it's going to be very important in probably the U.S. congressional race in PA 7 between Susan Wild and Ryan McKenzie. But that's just one person's opinion. One of the things that just came out last week was the Pennsylvania Supreme Court pretty much vacated the Commonwealth Court's decision when it came to undated mail ballots. What do you hear as a national political writer? What do you hear from some of the other media about Pennsylvania and the state's problems with getting mail ballots right?
A lot. I think a lot. Everyone remembers 2020 and waiting for the vote count to be done, and a lot of local reporters here had to explain what was going on and the history of the laws around counting ballots we have here, and I think there are a lot of questions and concerns just about kind of what are we going to know when, which votes are going to be counted. Obviously, we'll see what the final determination is on that, but it could even further delay what we know might be a delayed vote count.
Well, I do know from my experience as an election director in York County back in 2020, how long it took to count all the provisional votes that needed to be. And if the race is going to be as close as everyone predicts it will be, it's hard to believe that we're going to have an answer in the state, certainly by Wednesday morning.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you find that certainly we see the campaigns are flooding the airwaves with advertisements. They're coming into Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, but we're beginning to see campaigns also stop in some traditional areas that are, I guess, untraditional that you wouldn't expect to see. They're coming to Johnstown in particular as one bit. How important is that for them to make that case with some of the other towns within the Commonwealth?
Yeah, so we just saw Vice President Harris went to Johnstown and then Wilkes-Barre. And, we've seen perhaps earlier in the election cycle, former President Trump went to Philadelphia. These are the parties going to areas that are either, that are not areas they're necessarily going to win. And I think for the Harris campaign, they're looking at the map, they're looking at Pennsylvania, and they're looking at what President Biden did there in 2020 and saying, how can we get just enough out of some of these places to, replicate or even do better than he did, which matters statewide. And for former President Trump, I think they're saying, look, Philadelphia is always considered this bright blue city, but there are a lot of votes in Pennsylvania. There are a lot of Republican votes to be had in in Philadelphia. And they're just looking at the margins wherever they can to try to see how to win the state. A vote's a vote, as we know, whether it's in Northampton County or Bucks County or a less swingy place, it counts the same.
We'll let you go on this question. What are you hearing from, like I said, national political writer? What was the feedback that you heard about Josh Shapiro not being selected as Kamala Harris's presidential candidate?
I honestly heard a lot of surprise from some, be they national reporters or like national donor types. Although I think Shapiro was a bit of a favorite of some of the national donor types, just knowing how important Pennsylvania is and kind of making that leap that we don't necessarily know there's evidence for, that a home state candidate can help you win the state. But I definitely heard some surprise, and as he's continued kind of campaigning for her in other ways, I think that conversation at perhaps a lower decibel is still being had a little bit. The what ifs and whatnot. I certainly do think that the argument that by not being chosen, he can do a lot of campaigning in Pennsylvania for her without having to travel all over the country is also valid. So we'll see what happens. And then, of course, I was sort of chuckling. There was a campaign event where Governor Walz was, I think, nursing a young cow in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Really seemed to know his way around, the farm there. And while Governor Shapiro is an incredibly popular candidate or governor in the state, he's from Montgomery County, where I went to high school, as you said, doesn't necessarily have that kind of rural appeal that I think the Harris campaign is hoping plays across the state. So
there are retail politics, and then there's going out to the farm and milking the cow. Absolutely. Yeah. Our thanks to Julia Terruso, the national political reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer. We enjoy your work, and thank you very much for joining us today on Voices of Reason.
Thanks, Steve.
Welcome back to Voices of Reason. My name is Steve Ulrich, joined by our powerhouse roundtable, some of the members of the staff of Broad and Liberty. We have Beth Ann Rosica, Todd Shepherd, Kyle Sammin, and Terry Tracy. And first off, guys, I had the pleasure of attending in the spin room at the debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. I have my own thoughts, but I'm curious as to what you thought. Beth Ann, how did the debate come across to you?
I have to say, Steve, it was painful. It was painful to watch. And I was hoping at the end of that debate to feel strongly to have somebody to vote for. And that goal was not accomplished from my perspective.
Kyle, how about you? What were your thoughts and takeaways from the debate?
I thought that a strong debater on either side could have landed some real knockout punches because there were two candidates who, even more than in most elections, were determined not to answer the question they were asked. But neither one of them's a really strong debater. I mean, I think Harris had the better night, but they both really couldn't capture any of those, famous moments we've seen in previous debates, or even just present a really coherent case for why they are more qualified, or what the contradictions in their opponents' platforms are.
Terry,
I
about
didn't
20 minutes, for about the first 20 minutes, it seemed like the two were kind of jabbing, parrying, trying to find an opening. And then all of a sudden, probably the most memorable line of the debate came out from Donald Trump.
In what was billed as one of the most consequential moments of this campaign, it wound up being ultimately rather inconsequential. And after a June debate that was really quite consequential, this seems to have just muddied the waters a bit further with respect to who really is in the lead. Early polling after the debate seems to indicate some states have tightened, maybe some states that you would not have anticipated tightening have tightened. I think there was a poll out this morning that showed Harris only down 5 in Iowa, which is a place where former President Trump had a pretty sizable lead earlier in the year. But other than the races tightening and a lot of really very, very entertaining and very memorable memes, the contours of the race haven't really changed dramatically at all. And I think Kyle's right. I think that neither candidate really managed to answer questions that needed to be answered in order for the electorate to feel like there was a runaway favorite or a clear favorite in this race at this stage, in which we're now only 50 days out.
Todd, I mean, history has shown that obviously debates like this don't move the needle oftentimes, and it does seem like each camp is pretty much set in their ways. We might be talking about 5% of the electorate that was trying to make a decision. Do you think that happened at all?
Yeah, I think it probably did. Look, if there were still some, let's say, disaffected Republicans who maybe they're not completely anti-Trump, but they're still just not sure. I mean, I think they may have been able to make decisions from that. But to kind of echo some of the things we've already heard from the rest of our panel, I mean, if you go back to the debates, the original debates in 2016, Trump could debate largely off of vibes, right? Like, I'm going to wreck Washington. I don't play by politically correct rules. I say what's on my mind, and I don't let these campaign consultants craft these statements for me. I give it to you straight and those kinds of things. And I think we're just seeing that now that he's had a term, it's harder for him to debate and campaign on vibes. It should be hard for Harris too, and the media still has a lot of work to do there to try to pin her down on policy. But look, it's obviously also very hard for Trump, and we've already seen that now, where people have pressed him on, let's say, healthcare reform, Obamacare, and he said, well, I've considered various kinds of plans, and that's a laughable answer. It's no answer at all. So, but you're right. It does come down to that 5%. And, out of that, I'd say maybe, 10 to 15% of that 5% made up their minds. Frank Luntz, the Republican pollster, said that debate is going to be what sinks Trump's candidacy. So, we'll see.
Beth Ann, I know that one of the things that obviously both campaigns were trying to reach out to independents and make their case. But you also have to look at the state of Pennsylvania, and it's going to be the female vote and the Latino vote that may end up swaying the race either way. Wouldn't you agree?
I definitely agree. And I think that the Latino vote may be more consequential than the female vote. As much as I'd like to see suburban women in Philadelphia, which I think is the demographic that, both sides are really courting and hoping to bring, because they will be a big part of Pennsylvania. I do think that a lot of women, particularly moms in southeastern Pennsylvania, I think they already have their mind made up. And I think that sadly, a lot of them are voting on identity politics as opposed to on policies. And I think that we are going to see that in the collar counties. Whereas I think that the Latino vote is a bit more thoughtful in terms of their analysis of the situation. And I think that they are looking more at policy than what they have previously as a voting bloc. So I think I predicted that in Pennsylvania, the Latino vote may be more of the pendulum swinging and changing what could potentially be the outcome here.
A lot of people describe Pennsylvania's Latino belt running from Harrisburg northeast to Reading into Allentown. Kyle, what are your thoughts about the Latino vote in that belt?
Well, I was gonna say the same thing. I think Charles McElwee had an article a few months ago about that, and I think it's understudied. It's people are paying attention now, but I think because we're talking about people who are outside the major cities, I think a lot of major news organizations they've flown under the radar for them, and I think you'll see differences in the same way that the California Hispanic vote is different from the Texas Hispanic vote. I mean, people are different in different places. We've heard a lot of talk about how Trump's numbers are way up with these communities. Is it real? Is it not? And sometimes the polls shift based on how people self-identify to. Well, I mean, I guess we'll see in November is like a cop-out answer, but we will see in November. But I think he's going to show some improvement there, and if he wins this state, that's going to be why.
Terry, one of the things that I think that is important for everyone, now I've heard a lot of questions about what the turnout is going to be. And in 2020, Pennsylvania had 70% of its registered voters turn out. It's hard for me to believe that's not going to become higher in 2024. What kind of effect is that going to have on the statewide down ballot races, whether it's U.S. Senate, Attorney General, Auditor General, State Treasurer?
The reality is that it's been very difficult outside of the race for the United States Senate seat in Pennsylvania for the other campaigns to cut through. I think I saw my first Attorney General race out in the Philadelphia market over the weekend. But I mean, voters are just getting absolutely bombarded in every form of media that there is out there to advertise it with campaign ads, primarily from Vice President Harris's camp or former President Trump's camp, and certainly the McCormick Casey camp McCormick Casey race has heated up significantly. So down ballot effects, in terms of how do those candidates really effectively spend their money in order to have favorable outcome, it's probably better invested at this point in grassroots organizing, GOTV, supporting local party infrastructures than it is trying to carpet bomb the airwaves and cut through all of the noise that is the premier races in the state. Now, that being said, one of the more interesting outcomes in 2020 was the fact that you had the incumbent Democrat for state treasurer and the incumbent Democrat for Auditor General both lose in a year where President Biden defeated President Trump in the state. And while I don't think that there has been a ton of rigorous analysis done around that, it goes to show you that that kind of grassroots organizing can really make a difference, and that but candidates can buck the national trend, as even though that has become increasingly difficult to do, it is still possible. And so it will be very interesting to see how voters in a state where straight ticket voting is no longer permissible sort of do the cafeteria approach, right? They're going down the aisle and I'll take a little of this and I'll take a little of that. And what kind of message they're looking to send to the national parties, the national campaigns, and the state parties about what they like and what they don't like about what they're being offered right now. So I think that, and Pennsylvania being, a historically sort of idiosyncratic state when it comes to these sorts of things, will be really telling, I think, ultimately after we get through November the 5th, with respect to how voters feel about what the two national parties offered them this year.
Todd, I know I live in the central part of the state, Broad and Liberty headquarters located in the southeastern corner. Every once in a while, I'll watch a different news channel in the Philly market on a 6 o'clock news hour just to get a different blast of political commercials. They are different across the state. Do you agree with Terry's point? It's just like we've already been carpet bombed with with messages from the presidential campaigns with a smattering of Senate that there's not much oxygen left?
I do. I think we're really going to start to see a series of election cycles now where we just start to see a kind of information fatigue from voters. I mean, it's not only just that there's more news these days. The places that you're getting the news beamed to you, television, podcasts, your Facebook feed, your Twitter feed, the sheer amount of it is, it's just, it can't all be studied. It can't all be checked. And especially when you're talking about someone that might be looking at, 4 or 5 different races that they're trying to decide, or other local county issues that might be on the ballot, or what have you, that at some point, some people will just undervote a lot of these races. I mean, I think that could be one of the interesting things to study in terms of the question that you just asked, Terry. And I'll jump in terms of the question you also asked, Terry. I would also say I think there's a particular kind of Trump voter that's very Trump motivated, but is very disaffected by the Republican Party generally, right? That sees Trump as the only kind of true Republican. And so this is the kind of voter that goes and makes it a very, very close race between Biden and Trump in 2020, 80,000 votes or 44,000 votes between him and Clinton in 2016. But then in other races, there are these large gaps where maybe those Republicans didn't vote down ballot just because they think those other Republicans are rhinos or something. So I think the down ballot race is kind of look, I think Terry's right. It's very close. But I think there's a slight Democrat edge there because you have these very Trump energetic voters who are disaffected with the down ballot just because they see them as not real Republicans.
Throw one more question for the roundtable here on Voices of Reason to wrap up this segment. Last Tuesday night, probably the most coveted endorsement dropped from Taylor Swift endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris. Endorsements seem to have waned in popularity and importance over recent years. We know the Philadelphia Inquirer is going to endorse. We know the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette will endorse. Beth Ann, where do we stand with endorsements right now? Will that really sway the independent voter?
I don't think it'll sway the independent voter. I think the reality is that an informed electorate is what is most important. And those people who care about issues and policies are going to make decisions based on those points. I think that my fear always with every election is the uninformed electorate, because anybody that's going to vote for Harris because Taylor Swift endorsed her, it gives me pause as to why that person is voting anyway. So I think that it all comes down to being an informed voter. I read a great piece in the Free Press about a conservative who loves Taylor Swift, and that, yes, she can still be a Taylor Swift fan and not be so concerned about who she endorsed for president. So I don't think that any of those endorsements are going to make much of a difference at all.
Kyle, let me come to you with the idea of the newspaper endorsement, whether it's the Inquirer or the Post-Gazette, the Erie Times News. Any impact at all in this race?
I think they're only impactful if they go against type. If the Inquirer endorses a Republican, that says something. But when they endorse a Democrat, I think it's already priced in. Same with a Hollywood endorsement. I mean, if somebody from the movies or music endorses a Democrat, you're saying, well, yeah, we know. But I think the only ones that really carry weight might be political endorsements from politicians who have their own following. So I think RFK's endorsement of Trump actually does move the needle a little bit. Tulsi Gabbard's probably a little less because outside of Hawaii, she's not a big celebrity, but she does have her supporters among some, including independents and Democrats. Likewise, the Cheney endorsements of Harris, I don't know how many Cheney fans there are anymore, if there were ever, but to the extent that you might be a Republican who liked Dick Cheney or Liz Cheney, that matters because you're already kind of invested in them as a politician. But like anybody who's a conservative and enjoys books, music, movies, art, we've long learned to separate the artists' political opinions from the product they're producing. I don't think, like Beth Ann said, I don't think a Taylor Swift fan can't be a conservative either now or before she made the endorsement.
Because it's the type of thing where an endorsement like that it may end up just having more young people register to vote. Well, could that make an impact in that regard?
I think it will. And more than the endorsement, this tweet of Donald Trump's, I hate Taylor Swift, I think that's something that is really something that could motivate a first time, someone that's 19 or 20 and has never voted in a presidential election before. That could be the kind of thing to get them to register and vote. So I think the Taylor Swift endorsement matters. I think it's really maybe the only celebrity endorsement that actually could matter in the presidential in the presidential race, at least. As far as newspapers go, I don't think they matter at all when it comes to president of the United States. I think most people make up their mind, but I do think they sometimes can sway people who are maybe on the fence about offices that they just aren't really sure about, down ballot races like treasurer or auditor, that maybe they know a little bit about the office. They've heard some news about it in the past year or two. But this year they see a newspaper endorsement and that maybe sort of tilts them one way or the other.
The implicit endorsement of ABC News of Vice President Harris last Tuesday is probably the most impactful endorsement that's going to come from legacy media out there. I mean, unlike CNN, who I think acquitted themselves quite well in June, ABC News really dropped the ball. And the unwillingness to fact check one side after fact checking the other, after getting some of the fact checking wrong, after coming out publicly and saying that fact checking in the middle of the debate is somehow their obligation, it goes to show you that, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, they grossly misunderstand what their role is in the process. I've moderated debates before. Your job is to facilitate a discussion and ask insightful, incisive questions that garner a response from a candidate for the voter to hear in a forum in which they otherwise would not have been given that opportunity. That is your job. And ABC failed at their job. Instead, what they decided to do was put their thumb on the scales last Tuesday. There was plenty of criticism to go around for both candidates, quite frankly. I mean, the fact that Vice President Harris, on a question about an issue as serious as immigration, cynically pivoted immediately to, crowd sizes at Donald Trump's rallies. The fact that, Donald Trump dropped way too many opportunities to talk about the issues that matter most to voters, like the economy, like immigration, like foreign policy, in a world that right now is on fire, because he got upset that he was basically being a schoolyard bully was picking on him and calling him names, was a missed opportunity for the American people. But really, it was the implicit endorsement of ABC News last week that probably robbed the American people of one or two more substantive debates before Election Day. And ultimately, they showed their cards. And it's a shame. And I applaud CNN for handling it the way they handled it in June, despite people's reservations at the time. I would like to see both campaigns take up the Fox News invitation and do another debate and do it the right way. But, ABC, unfortunately, because of the way they handled that debate, fed into narratives about the way legacy media treats one side versus the other. And in that instance, their endorsement notwithstanding, the American people lost.
We will leave it right there. Our thanks to our roundtable, the staff from Broad and Liberty, Beth Ann Rosica, Todd Shepherd, Kyle Sammin, and Terry Tracy. Thanks so much for joining us today on Voices of Reason.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks.
And that will do it today for Voices of Reason. Our thanks to Republican Auditor General Timothy DeFoor, national political writer with the Philadelphia Inquirer, Julia Terruso, and our roundtable for the staff of Broad and Liberty. For all of us involved with Voices of Reason, my name is Steve Ulrich. Thanks for joining us.